We turn to Genesis chapter 20, and this is a somewhat shorter chapter, and will need much less comment than most because it almost sounds like a replay of something that happened at the end of chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, you remember that shortly after Abram obeyed God and went into the land of Canaan, a famine in that land caused him to choose to go into Egypt, where he thought he'd have a better chance of survival. And yet going into Egypt involved him in a compromise. First of all, we remember that God did not tell him to go to Egypt. At least there's no record of it. And it would seem perhaps that it was a compromise on his part just in going to Egypt, simply because it put him in a certain danger for which he had no promise of divine protection. And he resorted to his own stratagem of saying that his wife Sarai was his sister, which caused, of course, embarrassment later. Well, you would think that Abram would have learned his lesson. This was very early in his walk of faith, and we can appreciate the fact that people, when they begin to walk with the Lord, make many mistakes. But what surprises us is at this late point in his life, where he's 99 years old, he's been walking with the Lord for 25 years as a man of faith, that he would lapse into the very same behavior again, practically. And yet this shouldn't surprise us, because we find that in the Christian life, many times we do make the same mistakes when we're older in the Lord that we made when we're younger in the Lord, hopefully less often. But we sometimes think that that spiritual growth should just be a constant upward grade, starting at, here's the timeline of our life, and we start conversion here, and it seems like we should be growing sort of like this, just until we reach the image of Christ in sort of a constant upward movement without any kind of lapses at all. And of course we would expect maybe some problems at the beginning stage, but fewer and fewer as we go along. And I suppose in a sense the net result of our lives should show fewer and fewer sins and fewer lapses. But I think the growth is not just a steady upward climb. As we study the life of Abraham, it would seem like he takes a few steps up, and then he kind of bounces down to a low spot, and when he bounces back up, he's at a higher place than he was before. So it's more like this. And sometimes he bounces almost down as far, like at this point in his life, he's going down as far as he was in chapter 12. But I believe that each time he rebounded, he found himself at a higher level than he had been at before. And at least this is the way I perceive the life of Abraham, and also, I could say, the life of many Christians who've had some years in the Lord. Not that they always fall so low, but we never come to the place, as far as I can say, at least from my experience, where we don't fall into error anymore. I think there's always that tendency. We need to always be on guard. Though I do believe that spiritual growth means less and less of a tendency to do evil things, because our nature is being renewed. We're being transformed by the renewing of our minds. Our tastes are changing, hopefully. Hopefully our hearts are being weaned from the love of the things of the world, and our affections are being set on things that are above. But we never rid ourselves completely of the fact of our sinful nature. And our life will always be, until the day of our death, a warfare. Paul, at the end of his life, said, I have fought the good fight. I have run the race. And he says, now, as he was about to die, I'm ready to go get my crown, in 2 Timothy chapter 4. And it implies that he had to run his race just as much in the final years and fight the battle just as much in the final years, in fact, possibly more, as before. There's just as much potential to fall into error and to lapses of faith or even of morality when a person's been a Christian a long time, and I think probably because the devil sees that he's dealing with a stronger person and brings out his bigger guns. And if the Christian happens to be off guard at any time, or begins to trust in his own strength, and forgets that his whole walk is dependent upon just childlike trust in God, and by the way, the older you get in the Lord, the harder it is to remember that. Then, of course, you can fall, because when you're a new Christian, you know that you don't know anything. You know that you don't have any moral strength to keep the ways of God, and you know that the only hope is to trust in Jesus. But once you have established patterns of godly living, so that many of the sinful patterns have just fallen away and you're not living in those anymore, and you've learned many things and principles, and you've learned how to do battle and so forth, you sometimes are tempted to forget that your life is still just as dependent on the grace of God moment by moment as it ever was. And there's more of a tendency when you have a history of victories and of growth to look back and say, well, I'm much stronger than I used to be. I'm much more spiritual than I used to be, and to begin to think that because you are, that perhaps you don't think this consciously, it's just a sort of a subconscious thing, that perhaps you don't need to just lean so much on Jesus. You've got a lot of resources of your own now in terms of experience and wisdom and spiritual strength. And that simply isn't the truth. It is true that we do become more mature, but maturity is seen only in a more and more childlike reliance upon God. And so even when a person is rather mature in the Lord, he can, if he forgets to just trust in God, if he forgets to just trust in God and not in his own strength, he can fall just as low as a non-Christian can, or a new Christian can. And I've been shocked sometimes by men who were clearly men of God, who had been in the ministry for many years and seemed to be the epitome of virtue and strength, who you'd hear eventually, sometime that they run off with some woman in the church, and you just kind of shake your head and say, how in the world could that happen to him? I mean, maybe a new convert or something might do something like that, but how could that man do that? And I can think of a number of men like that. I thought, this is impossible. How could that man fall like that? And the answer is that the higher you are, of course, the harder you can fall. And so there are certain innate dangers that attend spiritual growth, but there is no danger to the person who has a committed dependence on God, a habit of total reliance and dependence on the Lord. Abraham was developing that, but it seems like there was a point, and I wouldn't say, why he fell on this occasion, but he fell right back into the same lack of faith, the same compromise, the same lie, here in his old age, after walking with the Lord for 25 years, as he did when he was first beginning to walk with the Lord. It's in chapter 20 that we read it. Abraham journeyed from there toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar, which was a Philistine city. Last time we read of his problems, he had gone into Egypt. This time he's in a Philistine city. And it says, and Abram said of Sarah, she's my wife. I'm sorry, of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said unto him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, She is my sister? And she, even she herself, said, He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. For I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet. And he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, This is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, He is my brother. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants, and gave them to Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of eyes, unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife. and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now, this story has a lot more detail than the story in chapter 12 about the Pharaoh taking Sarah in. Here, in the case of Pharaoh, we aren't told exactly how Pharaoh became aware that Sarah was really Abram's wife instead of his sister. We are told in chapter 12 that God had plagued the house of Pharaoh. But how he deduced from that Sarah was Abram's wife, we don't know, and that she was the cause of the plagues. Here we have actual case where God comes to Abimelech and speaks to him. The interesting thing here is that we are told, what we are not told earlier, in verse 13 and verse 12 and 13, that Sarah really was Abram's sister. She was his half-sister, daughter of his father, but not daughter of the same mother. Terah, the father apparently had more than one woman by whom he bore children, and so he fathered both Abraham and Sarai. And Abram, when he married her, had made an arrangement with her that she should always say, wherever they went, that she was his sister. Now, they probably justified this by saying, well, it is true. She is. But the situation here is that what they said was true in the letter, but false in the spirit. They were telling a truth that was intended to deceive. And very many times, Christians try to justify deception by telling the truth in a deceiving way. I mean, they can, if you've done something you're not supposed to do, and you've also done something that was legitimate to do at the same time, and someone says, well, where were you? What did you do? And you tell them only the thing that was legitimate that you did, and you don't mention the other thing, you justify yourself, I told the truth. I did that, but that's really only the truth in the letter. It's not truth in the spirit. Because, in fact, many times telling the truth can be a veiled way of deceiving, as was the case here. But I'm sure they found themselves able to justify it because it was half true. And, of course, because they probably reasoned that, the end justifies the means, and if it saves both of their lives, or at least Abram's life, to lie like this, then, it's the lesser of two evils. Lying may not be all that great to do, but certainly to save a person's life, lying would be justifiable. However, the Bible does not necessarily imply that that is true. We're not supposed to determine which of two sins is the lesser sin and then do that one. We should always do, as much as we know to do, the righteous thing. Now, true, Rahab lied and spared the lives of some men, and in this case, Sarah lied to spare the life of Abraham. But it's very clear that in Sarah's doing that, she was not commended. In fact, she was reproved for lying. Now, she was a submissive wife, and no doubt it was difficult for her to take this position. She was making a certain sacrifice herself in order to submit to her husband. But in this case, submission to her husband was wrong because he told her to lie. And while God has appointed duly ordained authorities, whether they be government authorities or authorities within the family structure and the family hierarchy or in the church, elders and so forth, God has ordained authorities who are to be submitted to within their sphere. But outside their sphere, they have no authority. And whenever someone gives instructions to another person to violate the principles of God, that person is just stepped out of his authority. Because his authority is to operate under God, to be an agent of God's authority. But as soon as he speaks against the authority of God, or operates authority against God's authority, that person no longer has authority. They are moving outside the sphere that God has given them. And while, of course, Sarah didn't have the Bible like we do, and didn't necessarily, maybe it's hard to say how much they were aware that lying was wrong. I have a feeling they had a conscience, though, and almost anybody in their conscience knows when they're telling a lie that they're not doing something quite right. The very fact that they fear that their truth will be found out is a testimony to their conscience that there's something wrong about what they're doing. At any rate, Sarah got reproved for obeying her husband in this situation. It says at the end of verse 16, and thus was she reproved. But it was one of those things where she probably thought the end would justify the means. Now, Rahab is commended in the New Testament. She lied, but she is not commended for lying. She is commended for her faith. But her faith, like that of Abraham and like that of everybody, was not perfect, and she had some problems in her life. David is commended, but not because he sinned with Bathsheba. And Jephthah is commended, but not because he sacrificed his daughter. And Samson is commended in the Scripture also in chapter 11 of Hebrews, but certainly not for his relationships with Delilah. It's clear that even people who are commended in Scripture for one thing or another about their lives, the Bible is not giving a blanket approval of everything that is recorded about the person. And so the fact that Rahab is commended for taking the side of God's people and trusting in God instead of in her pagan Canaanite deities, that does not mean that everything that is recorded about her, including her lying, was right. And here we clearly see that God did not favor a similar kind of lie for a similar kind of motive here. Therefore, we do not teach that a person should lie to save another person's life. Now, in the hypothetical situation people sometimes bring up, like if you're in the underground church and behind the Iron Curtain and you know where the Christians are hiding, or you know where the secret meeting's going to be, and you get caught by the secret police and they're going to interrogate you, shouldn't you lie to save your brethren, that they won't be arrested and caught? No, you can tell the truth. Just tell the truth this way. I'm not talking. That's the truth. But they might torture me. Well, better to be tortured than to sin. The Bible doesn't forbid us to be tortured. It only forbids us to sin. The Bible doesn't forbid us to die for righteousness, but it forbids us to compromise our righteousness in order to save our lives. Jesus said, "He that seeks to save his life shall lose it, and he that loses his life for my sake shall find it." So I believe that you can always tell the truth. The truth might be, I'm not talking. The truth might be, you can torture me if you want to, but I'm not talking. Now, that might sound awfully heroic for a person in a free country like this to be saying those things and say, well, that sounds pretty theoretical. What would you do if they really did it to you? And that's a good question. But the answer to that doesn't change the fact. The fact that I, personally, and I'm not, I believe God would give me the grace to do the right thing. I trust so. But the possibility that I might not do the right thing doesn't make the thing I do right. There are many times when people say, well, if you believe in turning the other cheek, what would you do if someone came and started pounding on you? Would you turn the other cheek? Well, I hope so. But even if I didn't, that wouldn't mean that just because I didn't do the right thing, that turning the other cheek wasn't the right thing. Many times we do things that we later realize were not the right thing. And what we're talking about is absolute standards. We're not talking about what we could probably be able to justify doing under the circumstances, under pressure. That's not what's right. What's right is what God said. And so we should always determine in our hearts to do what is right insofar as God gives us the grace to do so. Abraham and Sarah obviously should have told the truth. Now, as I said, we can hardly blame them for any of the lapses that they have because of the smallness of biblical light that they had. Whereas we have much more light, and to whom much is given, much is required. Anyway, God's dealings with Abram was somewhat severe, not as severe as it could have been. He did preserve Sarah. Now, in this case, the issues at stake in Abram's line were greater than in the previous case. Because in the previous case, Abram didn't even know that Sarah was the one through whom the promised seed was going to come. In chapter 12, that had not yet been revealed. So for her to be taken into the harem of the Pharaoh and even to be violated or defiled in that way would not as much affect the overall purposes of God. It would affect Sarah's life and the marriage between Abram and Sarah. But as far as the purposes of God, it would not be as greatly affected. But in this case, God had now announced that Sarah was to be the mother of the promised seed. And also, she was probably pregnant at this time, since in the earlier chapter, God had said in 9 months, she's going to have a baby. So by this time, she was apparently pregnant. So for her to be taken and defiled at this time would have very much brought an interference with the purpose of God. For her to become the wife of a heathen king, and for the child that was born to her to be attributed heir to the Philistine throne, that would hardly fit in with what God had revealed. Therefore, it behooved Abraham all the more to just put his case in God's hands and trust the Lord and tell the truth and do what's right and let God stand by his own purposes and defend them. But again, we see Abram taking matters into his own hands, as so often we do ourselves. Now, he said that the reason that he had deceived the Philistines in this case was because he judged that there was no fear of the Lord in this place. Remember that? It says in verse 11, Abram said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place. Well, that was clearly a misjudgment. Abimelech certainly feared the Lord. And it says even in verse 8 that when he told his people, they were sore afraid. Now, it's obvious that the fear of the Lord was in the place. Now, that doesn't mean they served Jehovah, because the Canaanites had their own god, Dagon, which was symbolically portrayed by an idol of a fish-headed being, and that was the Philistines' god. But, you know, in those days, the region in the Middle East was not just characterized by polytheism, where every nation had, you know, a multitude of gods. It was now developed to the point where each nation had their own tribal god, or their own national god. That was the general understanding in the Middle East in those days. It was believed that Dagon was the god of the Philistines. He was sort of the overall god to all matters that related to them. Moloch was the overall god to the Canaanites. Baal was the overall god to the Phoenicians, and Bel and Nebo were the overall gods, the national gods of the Babylonians. And it was believed generally that Jehovah was the national god of the Jews. Now, the Jews knew better. I mean, Abram knew better that this God that he served was the God of the whole universe. He wasn't just a national deity, a territorial God like these others were considered to be. He knew that he was serving the true God, the creator of heaven and earth, which all these other gods were just false gods. But as far as the neighboring tribes, they acknowledged that Abraham and his group, his entourage of several hundred people, that they had a tribal God named Jehovah. And they even acknowledged that this Jehovah had certain power. And they even feared him. But they just didn't worship him because they had their own territorial God in their lands. They served Dagon, and they knew that Abram served Jehovah. But as far as believing in Jehovah, many of these nations did. Many of the Canaanites believed that this God of Abram was a true God. And we find them using the name of Jehovah many times in their speeches with Abram. And that's because they did believe that each ethnic group or each nation had its own tribal or territorial deities, and they just figured Jehovah was one among many of those kind, that he was the one for the Jews and everyone else had their own. But you can see that Abimelech, who was not Jewish but Philistine, did fear Jehovah. Now, that doesn't mean that he worshipped Jehovah. He was a worshiper of Dagon, as his countrymen were. But they acknowledged the reality of Jehovah. And when Jehovah came and said, listen, you're messing with my people here, Abimelech feared Jehovah. And so did his people when they heard about it. Now, probably what added to the effect was it was clear that for some time no one in Abimelech's house was having children. It says that God had fast closed the wombs in verse 18 of all the house of Abimelech. Now, this could be disastrous, of course, to his dynasty. If none of his wives are having children, it could put an end to his dynasty and from his point of view, to the nation. And that's why he said in verse 4 to God, will you slay also a righteous nation? Now, God had just said to him in verse 3, you're a dead man. But he said, will you slay a righteous nation? In other words, his whole nation was endangered in the eyes of Abimelech, probably because his own dynasty was doomed to come to an end if his family didn't have children. And he now recognized that by bringing Abram's wife into his harem, he endangered his entire harem. That by bringing her in, God was judging the whole harem and judging the whole household and dynasty of Abimelech. So he suddenly came to the awareness. Now, he said, but I haven't touched her. In the integrity of my heart, I did this. I was honestly deceived by these people. I just did it in my own honesty. And God says, that's right, I know you did. And that's why I didn't permit you to touch her. Now, you have to realize that when a woman was taken into the harem of a king, of an Eastern king, she didn't just go immediately to his bedroom. She had to go through a process of preparation. We have some discussion of that in the book of Esther, how that when she was chosen to be the Persian queen of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as we commonly know him, that she had to go through a whole year of perfume baths and preparation and all kinds of skin treatments and things like that, because a woman who was going to be the queen or of the king's harem had to be, prepared. Now, I can't imagine that bathing in perfume for a year would necessarily make that much difference than bathing in perfume for half a day. But it was ceremonial. It was the idea that, you really have to go through the preparation before you come to the king's bed. And so Sarah may have been in the king's house for a number of months. And yet he had not slept with her because she would be going through the regular preparation period. And this would be long enough for it to become evident that none of the wives were getting pregnant. You see, it would take some period of time for that curse to be recognized as being present. And so there probably was a period of months during which she was in the king's house and Abraham was pacing the floor, and Sarah, of course, if she was already pregnant with Isaac, which seems almost certain, she would begin to show shortly after that. It would have been a really difficult situation that Abram got himself into, and I imagine that this time he learned his lesson. There's a reference to this story in the Psalms, in Psalm 105, which shows how God's providence and His protection was upon the patriarchs and the people of Israel, even from their founding of their nation. Remember, there were no Israelites at this time. There weren't actually Jews. It was just Abraham and his servants and his wife and Ishmael at that time. But in Psalm 105, it's sort of giving a history through this psalm of the Jews, starting with Abraham, and showing how God had been good to them and faithful to them all the way through. In verse 13 of Psalm 105 it says, "When they went from one nation to another, from one kingdom to another people, God suffered no man to do them wrong. Yea, He reproved kings for their sake, saying, Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. Moreover, He called for a famine on the land, and He broke the whole staff of bread, and sent a man before them, even Joseph." So he jumps from this story of Genesis 20 up to the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis. But he mentions how that when He led them from one nation to another, or it doesn't actually say He led them, it says they went. We're not sure that God led him to go into Gerar on this occasion, but when they went from one nation to another, God protected them, even though He had not necessarily drawn them or led them into that situation. He nonetheless came to their aid and reproved kings for their sake. This is implying that, God went out of His way even to reprove rulers in order to protect them and say, "Don't touch my anointed and do my prophets no harm." And so Abimelech came and he reproved them and embarrassed them, as they rightly deserved to be embarrassed. But he gave them gifts and also allowed them to stay in the land, which is quite generous of him. But this is because of course, the fear of the Lord that was on him. And it says in verse 17 that Abram prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. It must have seemed awfully awkward for Abram praying for Abimelech. I know that when my conscience isn't entirely clean, prayer doesn't come very naturally. And here he had just been reproved by Abimelech, and it was very clear that Abram was in error here. Abram was in sin, and Abimelech was more righteous than Abram. And yet here Abram's in the position to pray for this man to be healed, and it would just be an awkward situation. At least I would find it so. If I had just been caught in the act of doing something wrong to a person, and that person wanted me to pray for them, you just kind of feel unworthy. But it was simply because of the mercy and calling and election of God on Abram that Abram had the right to beseech God on behalf of this man. It shows that God doesn't choose a man or use him on the basis of his superior righteousness. Here, if it were on the basis of personal rightness in a situation, it would have been Abram who needed to be prayed for by Abimelech for forgiveness or whatever. But because of the election and calling of God, which is by sovereign grace upon Abram held a position unique in the earth with God at that time, and he was God's prophet and priest as far as that goes, and the only one who could really invoke Jehovah in the way that he could. And so he, in spite of his own personal lapse, was able to pray and see healing. So the healing ministry was found in Abram's life. He was a charismatic. Now, chapter 21, we have the fulfillment of the promise, the birth of Isaac. "And the Lord visited Sarah as He had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as He had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abram called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom to him Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, Who would have thought, or who would have said unto Abraham, that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abram made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. This was customary on the weaning of a firstborn child. Now, of course, Ishmael was older, but Ishmael was no longer considered to be legitimate in the sense that Isaac was. Although Abram for 13 years had thought of Ishmael as the promised seed, God had now revealed in chapter 17 that that was not the case. Ishmael was basically a product of a fleshly stratagem and was not the fulfillment of God's promise. So in a sense, in a very real sense, Isaac was recognized as the firstborn of Abram. And also in later on as the only son of Abraham, even though Ishmael was there. Later on, when God tells Abram to sacrifice Isaac, he says, "Take now your son, your only beloved son." And it seems clear that Isaac was treated with great preferential treatment, so much so that Ishmael was hardly even considered in the situation. When a firstborn son was weaned, there would generally be a great feast and party and celebration. This could have happened when Isaac was as old as 3 years old. The weaning of children was a more protracted process in those times. And I believe even still in some of those cultures that the weaning of children is not hurried, and often children are still nursing up to age 3 before they're actually weaned. So we don't know exactly how old Isaac was, but he was at least 1 year old and possibly as old as 3. And that means Ishmael, who was a good 14 years older, was either 15, somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. Ishmael here is not a little boy, although his behavior throughout this chapter almost makes him sound, it seems a little juvenile, it seems a little immature. And if you'd read the story without knowing the age of Ishmael, you definitely get the impression that the boy was quite immature and quite childish. However, we have to realize the boy was in his mid or late teens. And Ishmael here mocked Isaac. Now, Isaac evoked a lot of laughter, remember. And his name means laughter. Because Abram laughed when he first heard that Isaac would be born. Then Sarah laughed. And then when he was born, Sarah said everyone else is going to laugh too when they hear about this. And now we have Ishmael laughing. But not laughing the same way. He's not laughing in any kind of sense of honoring God's promise. He's laughing in mockery. I don't know what he found to mock in the situation. Perhaps he had a wounded spirit himself, realizing that he for many years had been the sole heir of Abram's fortune, and now Ishmael would get none of it, as it would seem. Actually, as it turned out later, Abram did give gifts, part of his inheritance, to Ishmael and to his other sons of concubines, as it turned out, but really, Ishmael had been kind of ripped off in his mind of the birthright and of the inheritance by this baby, and he may have just been kind of coming out of a wounded spirit. You can really hardly find anything about a young baby under 3 years old to really mock. Sometimes you laugh at their childish things, but you don't find, it's not exactly the same thing as mockery. So probably Ishmael's mocking was probably just kind of a bitterness, being, a sort of an irrational kind of bitterness that he held toward Isaac. It says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abram, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abram's sight because of his son. He loved Ishmael, and he realized now that there's going to be a conflict between the two families. Anybody who's got stepchildren, and natural children too in the home, knows how difficult it is for a mother of a natural child to relate well with the child of a previous marriage or of another relationship. And obviously Sarah would be jealous over her son, especially since there had been personal conflicts between herself and Hagar previously. You remember that when Hagar first became pregnant, she began to hold Sarah in contempt. And there had been a serious conflict that had led to Hagar seeking to flee, but the Lord had sent her back. And now Sarah finds the behavior of Ishmael intolerable here. She never did like Ishmael much anyway, I'm sure. And now she finds him mocking her son, and she's a protective mother hen, and a Jewish mother at that. And so you can see that she's not going to tolerate this for a moment. And she comes to Abraham and says, Get this boy out of here. Now, to Abraham, he loved Ishmael just as much as he loved Isaac. Or at least nearly so. For 13 years he had thought of Ishmael as his heir, as his, as the hope of the promises of God. And he was his natural seed. And so, of course, he would have a much natural affection toward Ishmael, and so it would grieve him to realize suddenly there's going to be conflict in the family because of these two children from different mothers. And it says it grieved him because of his son. But God spoke in favor of Sarah in this case. In verse 12, God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah has said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Now, in this case, God actually told Abram to listen to his wife. And we remember that one of the problems Adam had was that he did hearken to the voice of his wife, and he ate the fruit. And earlier in Genesis, Abram got into trouble because he hearkened unto the voice of his wife in chapter 16 and verse 2 and went into Hagar. Now, sometimes hearkening to a wife can be bad, but there are times when God says, your wife has the word of the Lord here in this situation. In fact, Sarah was speaking the word of the Lord in the case, because her words in verse 10 are quoted in Galatians verbatim, and Paul says this is what the Scripture says. In other words, he implies that it's God's word, and he brings it up also in a connection of an allegory that he's making from it. But it's in Galatians chapter 4. I'll read to you what it says there. It says in Galatians 4:29 through 31, But as then he that was born after the flesh, meaning Ishmael, persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, meaning Isaac, even so it is now. Now, Paul is drawing a connection here between the two kinds of sons of Abraham. Let me quickly summarize what Galatians 4 is talking about here. Paul is comparing, but he's reminding his readers that Abram had two sons, and they were very different in their character and their destiny. One son was, strictly speaking, a son of the flesh, Ishmael, and was born in bondage because his wife was a bondwoman. The other son was a spiritual seed given strictly as a miracle son and a legitimate freeborn son. And he makes this parallel. He says, essentially, that the freeborn son of Abraham is like us. Regardless of whether we're Jews or Gentiles, we're the spiritual seed of Abraham, just like Isaac was sort of the spiritual or miraculous son of Abraham. So we, the Jews and Gentiles who are believers, are the spiritual seed of Abraham, and therefore we're the free ones. But he says Abraham also has fleshly seed, meaning the Jewish people who are unbelievers. Unbelieving Jews are just children of the flesh of Abraham, and they're in bondage, he said, to the law. And he said that they persecute us, Christians, just like Ishmael persecuted Isaac. And so he's drawing some parallels there between Abram's two sons and the two kinds of sons Abram has now. Today there are physical sons of Abraham, the physical Jews, and there are spiritual sons of Abraham, which is the church. And Paul makes it very clear here that the Jews who are in unbelief are like Ishmael. And then he quotes Sarah in verse 30 here. Galatians 4:30 says, Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. This is basically a quote of what Sarah said. Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for he shall not be heir with my son. Now Paul says, So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Now what he's saying is we Christians are like Isaac. The Jews who aren't believers are like Ishmael, and he even quotes the Scripture saying, Cast out the bondwoman and her son, because he will not be heir with the son of the free woman. Now what's this saying but that the natural Jews will not be heirs with the church unless they convert and become part of the church, which is definitely in conflict with the vision a lot of people have for Israel, because some people say that the Jews, whether they're in faith or out of faith, that they're the chosen people anyway. You know, that they're God's chosen ones and they're heirs and so forth. But Paul makes it clear that's not the case. If they're not of the free woman, if they're not born again of the Spirit, if they're not spiritual seed of Abraham, then they are not to be heirs with those of us who are. They will not have an inheritance. Now, that doesn't mean that God has cast off the Jews, because Jews can be saved today just as much as Gentiles can be. But they have to become Christians, in which case they're no longer Jews, because in Christ there's no Jew or Gentile. They're now Christians. So in a sense, being Jewish is not a blessing, but a curse. They have to give up their distinctive Jewish identity, just like we have to give up our national and Gentile identity in order to become something new and have a new identity in Christ. Well, Sarah here is speaking words which Paul later quotes as Scripture. He quotes them as basically God's word to Abraham. And so Abram was grieved about it. Sometimes the word of the Lord is grievous because it goes against our grain naturally, but God confirmed that that he should listen to Sarah in this case, and that she was speaking truth. So he had to send away Ishmael and Hagar. And so it says in verse 13, and also the son, let me just give you verse 12 again. And God said to Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called, not in Ishmael. And also the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. Now there was a blessing of sorts on Ishmael also, simply by virtue of the fact that he is the seed of Abram. Even though it was not necessarily God's instructions that brought about the life of Ishmael, God would honor the fact that he did have some relationship to Abraham, and therefore there'd be a blessing, but he would not be the promised seed. He would not have the inheritance, but he would nonetheless come under some temporal blessing. God would watch out for him. And perhaps that's the way we should understand God's dealings with Israel today, whom Paul again compares with Ishmael. Now don't be confused. The Jews today are not descended from Ishmael. They are descended from Isaac, physically. And it is the Arabs today who are descended from Ishmael. Paul is not talking about natural descent. He's using spiritual types. He's saying that spiritually speaking, the Jews are like Ishmael. And spiritually speaking, Christians are like Isaac in the types and the allegory he's giving. But if we see Ishmael as a spiritual type of the Jews, then we can understand perhaps why God has been good to the Jews in many cases, even, for instance, in modern wars where they seem to have had supernatural aid in some of the endeavors they've been in, the Six-Day War and the rescue at Entebbe and many other places where it seems like supernatural aid has been come to the Jews. And some see that as evidence they're still the chosen people, but that's not evidence at all. God causes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and so forth. But it may be that he is blessing them in a temporal way just to honor Abraham. But that doesn't make them saved, and that doesn't make them spiritually preferred. Just like Ishmael, because he was descended from Abraham, God would temporally, that is, in this earthly life, in some ways bless him, just to honor Abraham. But that he still could not be the promised seed. He still was not to have the spiritual inheritance. So it says, because he is thy seed, I will make him a great nation. Verse 14, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, apparently on her way back to Egypt, which is where she was from. It seems strange that Abram would give them such scant provision. Here he was a rich man. It seems like he could have laden them with several ass loads of provisions, but he gave them a bottle of water and some bread and says, good luck, It seems extremely strange that he would do that, and perhaps he was trying to say very strongly, you're not in favor now. You don't think that you can come back or something. I'm not sending you off with great fanfare and great flourish and great blessing. This is a permanent departure. And I'm sure that he did not intend for them to run out of water in the wilderness and die there. But Abram did have the promise from God that Ishmael would become a great nation. Therefore, he knew that he wouldn't die out there in the desert on his way somewhere else. But it does seem a little strange that he only gives them a bottle of water, and it turns out they run out of water before they get where they're going. Now, he might have given them enough water to get to some nearby place where they could live, but they're not going directly anywhere. They kind of wander around in the wilderness. And I don't know why they wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba instead of going directly to some other place where they could live safely. Anyway, they did run out of water in verse 15. The water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. Again, it sounds like he's a little kid, but he's 15 to 17 years old, and she cast the child. The word child in the Hebrew is very flexible. It is used of very small children who, before they are weaned. The same Hebrew word is used of people in their teens. Joseph, when he's in his teens, this word is used. Also, remember when Elisha called the she-bears down and they tore 42 children that had mocked him? Some people get really upset at that story because they see God bringing she-bears down on these children who were mocking. But as it turns out, the word children is the same here. It could refer to young men in their late teens even, mocking the prophet. Anyway, she apparently, her strength lasted more than Ishmael's did. He probably had a rather pampered life in the tents of Abram in those years when he was the pampered, chosen seed. And therefore he was not accustomed to the wilderness like Hagar had been before. And so he ran out of strength and vitality before she did. She threw him under a shrub, then put some distance between her and him because she couldn't stand to watch him die, as she thought he would. Now this is lack of faith on her part, but we can hardly blame her for it. I mean, God had told her already that he was going to make a great nation out of her son, and that had not yet happened, so it was obvious that he couldn't die out there, I mean, if God's promise was to be fulfilled. But then again, it's hard to blame Hagar, because many times when you're really at the point of desperate hunger and thirst in the wilderness, and you see absolutely no means of provision, even with the promises of God, we sometimes wonder, is God going to come through? Think of the Jews when they came out of Egypt, and they saw the great deliverance through the Red Sea. Within 3 days, they were wondering if God was going to let them die in the wilderness, because they didn't have good water. And, God was a little upset about that, but he tolerated it, because he knows our natural weakness. And our weakness is definitely to forget the promises of God in the face of circumstances that are very sorely trying. Well, it says, she went and sat down, in verse 16, over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot, which would be some distance, actually. For she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him, that is, over away, across from him. And she lifted up her voice and wept. Now, interestingly, it says that she lifted up her voice and wept, but God heard the voice of the lad. It doesn't say he heard the voice of Hagar, who was lifting up her voice and weeping, but he heard the voice of the lad. And this shows that, I think it's stated this way. He could have said God heard Hagar, and I'm sure he did. But the reason it is stated that God heard the lad is because it is the boy who has the promises of God upon him. That is, God had made no promises about Hagar's future, only about Ishmael's future. Hagar, as far as that went, could die, and the promises of God could still be fulfilled in Ishmael. And God had a covenant with Ishmael. It wasn't the same as his covenant with Isaac, but it was a covenant nonetheless. Therefore, God heard the cry of his covenant son, in a sense. And God, it's like he remembered Noah in the ark because he had a personal covenant relationship with him. And here, there was no special covenant relationship between Hagar and God, but there was between Ishmael and God. And so God heard the cry of the boy. This is not in any way to suggest that God was deaf to the woman's cries. In fact, of course, in coming to the aid of the boy, he actually was answering Hagar's prayers. And both she and the boy were saved. But the way it's worded seems to imply we're to understand that there was a special sense in which Ishmael had the ear of God, because he was the physical seed of Abraham, and there had been certain promises made to him. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make of him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad to drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So the Arab peoples are, according to this, about 3/4 Egyptian. Because Hagar was Egyptian, and Ishmael was the product of union between Abram and Hagar. So he was half Egyptian himself. And then he took an Egyptian wife, which meant his children would be 3/4 Egyptian and only 1/4 Hebrew. And so that is the ethnic background of the Arabs, according to the Scriptures. So she took a wife for him out of Egypt. And it says in verse 22, And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech, the scene changes now because God has come to the aid of Ishmael, and we don't hear about him again until Abram dies. And then Ishmael and Isaac stand together as grown men at the tomb of Abraham to do their last respects, apparently reconciled with each other many years after this event. Anyway, verse 22, And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, that means the leader of his armies, spoke unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee. thou shalt do unto me and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abram said, I will swear. Now, basically, Abimelech recognizes the blessing of God on Abram. Abram is prosperous. His household is large. He's got military power at his disposal, as we saw in chapter 14. And he's basically acknowledged to be a powerful chieftain in the area by the neighboring cities. And so the king of the Philistines says, let's make a non-aggressions pact, which Abram agrees to. And Abram reproved Abimelech. First of all, he says, first of all, before we make this agreement, I've got a bone to pick with you. He reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away from Abraham's servants. Apparently, Abraham had dug a well, and it was being guarded by Abram's servants, but Abimelech had some servants who came and violently took it away. Now, this was unknown to Abimelech until this time. But it had been a sort of something that Abram had in his craw that he thought, well, before we enter into this pact, let's get this thing cleared up. And wells, you have to appreciate, were very, very valuable in those days. You can see how many times people almost died in the wilderness. Hagar twice almost died in the wilderness because they didn't have enough water. And that's common enough. People in deserts, water is definitely at a premium. And in a day before they had well-digging equipment, when a well had to be dug by hand, it's very clear, in the desert you have to dig a deep well in order to get water because the water table's low. You can see how much expense and energy and effort would have to go into even digging a well, so that a well would become a valuable commodity. And you could see why people who were aggressive toward others might want to take a well from someone and save them the trouble of digging one. But Abram apparently had not done anything to avenge the theft of this well. It was his well. The Philistines had taken it by force from him, but he had just he could have armed his servants and gone back and taken it forcibly. But again, he appears to be more or less a peaceable man and decided to let the matter rest until this time. But it was a good time for confrontation. You know, this maybe is a good example to us, too, that when we're wronged, we don't necessarily have to go to our own defense and cause a big strife about it with the person who wrongs us. However, we shouldn't pretend like nothing is there. If there's a wrong that needs to be righted, when there is a time for conversation with the person, this apparently is the first time Abimelech and Abram had a chance to see each other after the well. He used it as an opportunity to clear that up. He could have pretended like there was no wrong, but in his heart there would have been an unresolved bitterness toward Abimelech, wondering, did he order his servants to do this? Here I'm making some kind of a brotherly agreement with him, and I have these suspicions about the man. So Abram wisely confronted him on the matter, and confrontation is a good thing for relationships. A lot of times we don't confront because we're afraid it'll ruin relationships. And the only kind of relationship that'll be ruined by a confrontation is a relationship that has no substance to it in the first place. The Bible says that he that rebukes a man afterwards finds more favor than he that flatters with the lips. And a lot of times we will flatter rather than rebuke because we don't want to risk losing friendship. But the Bible clearly says that a person who reproves and rebukes a person will later be appreciated for it more than the person who kind of holds his peace and just lets bitterness fester within his heart toward it. He wanted to clear things up right now so there'd be no grounds for hostility afterwards, and they could both operate in relationship with a clean conscience about this thing. So he confronted Abimelech, and as it turned out, Abimelech was innocent of that. He didn't know about the situation until Abram brought it up. So it was a good thing Abram did bring it up, because if he hadn't, he'd be wondering, is this Abimelech's hostile aggression against me, sending his servants to do this? And as it turned out, it was made clear that Abimelech had not willingly done anything wrong, and I'm sure that made it a lot easier for the relationship to be healed when that communication took place. And in verse 26 says, Abimelech said, I wot not, or I know not who has done this thing, neither did you tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but to this day. Now the suggestion here is that maybe Abram should have brought it up earlier. You never told me about this, How long did you carry in your heart this suspicion toward me and this hostility toward me without bringing it up? If you'd brought it up earlier, our friendship could have remained intact, better. We wouldn't have had this rift. At any rate, things got healed here. And Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abram set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, For these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Therefore, that place is called Beersheba, which means either the well of the oath or the well of the 7 ewes, because there they swear, both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, or of his armies, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord Jehovah, the everlasting God. And it says, and Abram sojourned in the Philistines' land for many days. Now these 7 ewe lambs seem to be in addition to the regular gifts of livestock that were given back and forth in the process of making this covenant. Some of them would have been sacrificed. But in addition to the ordinary animals that were exchanged and sacrificed, Abraham set aside specifically 7 lambs not to be sacrificed, but to be kept by Abimelech. And their presence in Abimelech's flocks would continually be a witness and a reminder that this particular well belonged to Abraham. Because in the very act of receiving these, Abimelech was acknowledging, okay, these are a token, these are a witness that this is your well. So as long as those sheep were around, they would always be a reminder. Brother Bruce was sharing with me once that spiritual type that he saw in this, which is kind of interesting. He thought of these 7 ewe lambs as being a picture of the 7 churches, or basically the church, since 7 is a symbolic number of completeness. That as the church is like sheep among wolves, and we're God's flock and so forth, that he saw this as a picture of the church in the world. God depicted by Abraham, and the world being depicted by Abimelech. God has given the world, the church, as a witness that he has dug a well. As of course the well of eternal life. Jesus said, he that believes on me, out of his innermost belly shall flow rivers of living water. He said that water will become a well within him, springing up into everlasting life. So the church is given by God to the world as a testimony, or to be a testimony to the world, that God has dug and provided a well of living water. I thought that was an interesting application. And so Abram called on the Lord there at the grove that he planted in Beersheba. In chapter 22, then, we have one of the most pathetic stories. Pathetic not in the sense that, some stories are more pathetic in that, a good man is shown to be evil. This is pathetic in the fact that actually Abram is shown to be good, but the cost, the emotional stress that he came under is where the pathos of the story is. Here, we don't know how many years elapsed at this point. Isaac was somewhere between the age of 3 and 37 when this took place. Traditionally, Josephus said that Isaac was 25 years old when Abram offered Isaac upon the altar. But Josephus has no biblical data for saying that. It's simply apparently Jewish tradition. I had heard other traditions that Isaac was closer to 30, in his middle 30s at this time. At any rate, the consensus seems to be that Isaac was a grown man at this time. Now, again, we don't have scriptural hard data on that, and there's no way to actually deduce the actual age of Isaac in this story. And the reason I make even a point of it is because it seems to make a great deal of difference in the way we view Isaac if he was only a little child or if he was an adult at this time. Realizing that Isaac was 100 years younger than Abraham. You remember how that Abraham in this story actually bound Isaac and was about to offer him on the altar. If Isaac was a little boy, he would have no strength to resist his father. But if Isaac was a young man in his prime, 25 to 35 years old, Abraham being well past his prime, 100 years older than that, it would seem that Isaac would have the power to resist his father, and yet the fact here is that he did not. And this would make him, this would show Isaac to be definitely a virtuous and submissive son, who, though he had power to resist what was about to take place, out of honor to his father and out of respect and trust in his father, was willing to just submit to what seemed like a radically insane course of action. Let's go ahead and read it. You're probably familiar with the story. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I, innocently, not knowing what to suspect. I mean, behold, here am I. Hineni in the Hebrew is sort of the common response people gave when God called them, when Samuel was called, when Moses was called, when Abram was called, when Isaac was. Whenever God called someone by name, they would say, Hineni, which is Hebrew for, here am I. And in most cases, when God was calling someone, he had something good to say to them. At least that had been the case in the past. When Abram had heard from God, God would say, Abram would say, Hineni, here I am. And God would say, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to, give you this land. God always had good news. And so here, another occasion, God calls Abraham and he says, here am I, suspecting probably nothing of the sort as what he was about to hear. And God said to him, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Every word seems to be a jab at the heart of Abraham. He could have just said, Take your son and sacrifice him, but he says, Take now thy son, thine only son, whom you love. I mean, every word is just a stab, Your only son, the one you love. Take him and offer him as a burnt sacrifice on the place I'll show you. What a test of Abram's obedience this became. By the way, you might notice that the language of this is borrowed in the New Testament. When God speaks of Jesus as his only begotten son, or as his beloved son, this is language that the New Testament borrows from this story about Jesus, because the decision that Abram had to make to offer Isaac in obedience to God is in many senses paralleled, at least in the emotions of the Father God offering his Son for our sins. And so, this is an amazing thing, because previously, when Ishmael had to leave the home, we're told that Abram grieved. When Sarah dies, a few chapters hence, we find that Abram mourns for her. But here we have absolutely no discussion of Abram's emotions. It's almost like this event was so holy. This event was so personal, and it struck so deep that the author spares us, or spares Abraham, our scrutiny. He spares the exposure to this man's inner grief that he experienced. And we have no argument coming from Abraham here. Now, the difficult thing for Abraham here would be, there'd be many difficulties. One is the natural difficulty of anyone sacrificing their son or killing their son. That goes against all the natural emotions of anyone. It would take a total pervert to not respond in abject grief to such a proposal. But furthermore, Abraham was, even in the natural, more in a position to be grieved, because he was definitely at the age where he could never have another son, and his wife could never bear him another son. I mean, this was his only son. He's 100 years old, or 100 and something years old. We don't know exactly how old, but he's over 100 years old. He could, as it would seem, never replace this son. And of course, being the son of his old age, Isaac had been sort of the fulfillment of all his lifelong hopes. For 100 years he hoped to become a father, and now he finally had one. You can see how his affections would attach upon this child who was the only hope of carrying on his name and so forth, and just the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. You could see how this man would be attached to his son Isaac. And furthermore, of course, there was even perhaps the far more important issue. God had promised that through Isaac, many nations would be formed, and all nations of the earth would be blessed. And that had not happened yet. Isaac was not even married. Whether he was an adult at this time, we don't know, but Isaac wasn't married until he was about 40. And this was before that. So clearly, if he killed Isaac, it would seem absolutely impossible for the promise of God to be fulfilled. And all of these things were working against Abraham's obedience. All these pressures were upon him to totally say, I rebuke you, devil, that can't be the Lord, But he didn't have any way to try the spirits. He didn't have scriptures. He didn't know how to test the spirits. He probably didn't even know about the devil. There had been no revelation made about the devil. All he knew was whenever God appeared and spoke to him, he was obligated to do what God said. And so whatever his grief, it's not described, but we can only imagine. And perhaps we can't even. Yet in verse 3 it says, Abram rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took his two of his young men with him and Isaac, his son. The word young men here is the same word that's translated child of Ishmael earlier, so you can see how flexible that Hebrew word is. He took 2 servants, 2 young men with him, and took Isaac his son, and clave wood, that is, he cut wood for the fire, and rose up and went unto the place which God had told him. Now, notice he rose up early in the morning. He didn't wait around till noon to see if God was going to change his mind. He didn't say, Lord, I need more confirmation, just because it was a hard word, you know. He offered early obedience. He knew God had spoken. He was just going to obey as soon as he could. As hard as it was to bring himself to do so, he didn't even question whether he should obey God, and he didn't wait around to see whether he could somehow justify taking a different course of action. He just got up first thing in the morning, saddled the donkey, and went about the business of obedience. And it says, on the 3rd day, Abram lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. So he had to journey for 3 days to get to the place. I have no doubt that this was just his secret between him and God. It's clear Isaac didn't know what was going to happen by what follows. The young men didn't know what was going to happen. I am sure that Abram didn't tell Sarah about this. So you can imagine how in those 3 days of his traveling, his son was dead in his own mind. I mean, as far as he was concerned, there's no question. He's going there, he's going to kill his son. He spent 3 days grieving in anticipation. It would have been much easier if he could have instantly slain his son and then tried to recover from it, just start recovering. He's going to have to somehow recover eventually. But to anticipate it, sometimes the anticipation of pain or the anticipation of grief is even worse than the grief itself. And here he had spent 3 days prodding along to this place, and in his mind every day thinking about what he was going to do. And, no doubt many times it came to his mind, how in the world are the promises of God going to be fulfilled? What am I going to tell Sarah? She'll die of grief when she hears of it. She'll think I'm insane. It just must have been really a heart-wrenching experience for him. But the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abram was so much a man of faith at this time that he was determined to go ahead and offer his son, if that's what God required, knowing that in order to fulfill God's promises, God would have to even raise Isaac from the dead. And while Genesis tells us nothing about this particular hope of resurrection, Hebrews, in talking about it, says that Abram believed that if necessary, God would even raise Isaac from the dead. Which means that Abram fully intended to really go right on through with this, and just figured, well, he never heard of anyone rising from the dead before, but that's the only way he could figure it could ever happen. And so, but he was, shuffling along, and took 3 days, and he finally lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Any conversation between him and Isaac during this time must have been a real grief to him. Just his son was innocently unaware of what was going on. I mean, just talking to his dad, probably having just a friendly conversation along the way, and all the time Abram knowing that he was going up to kill this boy, or this young man. And Abram said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. Now he doesn't say, and I will come again to you, and he doesn't say, and we will come again to you. He just says, and come again to you. But the implication is that I and the lad will go, and I and the lad will come again. Implying again that even though he fully intended to carry out the instructions, he just knew God had to do something. God had to, he didn't expect God to intervene in the way it did happen, but he just figured God's going to have to raise him from the dead. I'm going to stay up there until he does. And then we'll come back down. So he left the men down there. And it says, and Abram took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife. And they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abram said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And so they both went of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son. At this point, obviously, Isaac got an idea of what was going on. With the possible exception that Abram hit him over the head with a rock when he wasn't looking and knocked him out and bound him. But it doesn't imply that at all. I'm sure that it would appear that Isaac was submissive in all this. There's no record of resistance or even any protest on Isaac's part. His total trust in his father is implied throughout the account. And he bound Isaac, his son, and he laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abram stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. Last time he'd said that to God, it had been bad news that had come. But this time it's good news. And the angel said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abram lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abram went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abram called the name of the place Jehovah-Jireh, which either means the Lord sees or the Lord provides. It can be rendered either way from the Hebrew. But basically, God seeing our need is the same thing as Him providing, because He can't see it without coming to our aid, just due to His care for us. As it is said unto this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. That is, at the time that Moses wrote this, he said, even to this day, there is a saying among the Jews, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Mount Moriah, where this took place, the very spot where Abram offered Isaac, is the place where Solomon later built the temple. And obviously, very near that point is where Jesus was crucified, in the same mountain range, just outside the temple district. And so, this general area, which was 3 days' journey from where Abram was residing, but God had him travel 3 days to get to this spot, because this was going to be a sacred spot in the future for Abram's descendants. The temple would be built right there. Eventually, Jesus would even be crucified there. And some have seen, even in Abram's cryptic remark, My son, God shall provide Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. A prophecy of Jesus, who was God, providing Himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And we see much in this story that foreshadows the sacrifice of Christ. Abraham in this clearly is a type of the Father, and Isaac a type of Christ. And the reason I say that's clear is because there are a number of places in the story of Isaac where Isaac is seen to be a type of Christ. He is the child of promise. He is the seed of Abraham through whom all nations were to be blessed. He is the one that the Father offered up. And notice how many parallels there are, by the way. It was 3 days that Abraham endured the grief of his son being dead as they traveled. Isaac was dead in the mind of Abraham for those 3 days as they traveled. He actually offered Isaac on practically the very spot where Jesus was later crucified. Isaac actually carried the wood on his own back up to the place where he was to be offered, just as Jesus carried his own cross for a period of time until he collapsed under it. There are many parallels here. Of course, obviously, the obvious parallel that Isaac was the only beloved son of his father being offered. Where the parallels break down is, of course, in no sense here was Isaac being offered for the sins of the world, as Jesus was. However, there is even a picture of that in this story in the ram that was caught in the thicket, because here the ram, the type shifts, and the ram becomes the type of Christ, and Isaac becomes the type of the redeemed one, because the ram became the substitute for Isaac on that altar. Abram had said that God would provide Himself an animal to be a sacrifice. And as it turned out, that ram became the substitute for Isaac. And it was offered on the altar instead of Isaac. So we do see even the picture of redemption there, although there's a shift of type at that point where Isaac is the one who's redeemed and the ram becomes the type of Christ. But that kind of shifting in types is not uncommon in the Scripture. So you can see then that there is a foreshadowing here of Christ. And it says about this in Hebrews 11, in the verse I was talking about earlier that talks about Abraham's faith that Isaac would be raised from the dead. Let me give this to you the way the writer of Hebrews says it. Hebrews 11 and beginning with verse 17 through 19. It says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested or tried, offered up Isaac. And he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Accounting," that is, Abraham was accounting, "that God was able to raise him up even from the dead." Then it says, "From whence also he received him in a figure." This word figure in the Greek is parable. He indicates that this whole transaction was a parable. It says, in an allegorical sense, Abram received his son back from the dead. Well, what's that a parable or an allegory of? Well, what could it be? But the parable of depicting the fact that God would receive his son back from the dead also. In an allegorical sense, Abram received his son back from the dead, though Isaac didn't actually die. Yet as far as Abram was concerned, he was dead for those 3 days. And so in a sense, he received him back from the dead. This test of Abraham's faith has been viewed forever after as the ultimate demonstration of how greatly this man had grown in faith from the time that God first called him. Realize he'd been walking with the Lord for possibly 50 years or more at this time. And this was the ultimate test of his faith. Look at James chapter 2, where again Abram is commended for this. James chapter 2, verse 21 says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works, when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect or complete?" In other words, he's not saying we're justified by works, because we know that Abram was justified by faith. Genesis 15:6 tells us that. But his justification by faith was made evident and reached its complete manifestation in the ultimate obedience. You can tell if a person has faith by their obedience to God. And his faith was made complete, or that is to say that the missing part was supplied in the sense that the full evidence of his faith was there in the fact that he ultimately obeyed God in offering Isaac on the altar. This is obviously treated by the later writers in the Scripture as the epitome of obedience. And it certainly is. And I would say also, people have been stumbled by the fact that it says at the very beginning of Genesis 22 that God tempted Abraham in this, and we need to just be aware that the word tempt in the Old English is used to translate a Hebrew word that means tested. He put him to the trial. He tested Abram's faith. And this was not so much in order for God to find out what Abram would do, but for us to find out what Abram would do. God knew what Abram would do. He knew Abram's heart. He could see Abram was being obedient from the moment that Abram saddled his ass, and I'm sure that God even knew the future before that. I believe God has absolute foreknowledge of these things, of all things. But if this test had not been made, we would never know what Abram would have done. And he could never have been held out as an example to us for supreme sacrifice to God. And this is exactly what this story is to teach us. And that is the supreme sacrifice. Remember, we were talking about the death of a vision in an earlier case where he had the vision of Ishmael originally being his heir, and then God had to take that from him. He had to die to that vision. And then the vision of having an heir was resurrected actually in the birth of Isaac. But now, he even had to die to that vision. He had to die to Isaac. He had to basically give Isaac to God in a way that was very genuine. Now, sometimes people tell us that in order to be a disciple, you actually literally have to sell everything you have and give it away to the poor, and if you possess anything, you're really compromising, because Jesus said you have to forsake all that you have to be his disciple. And if you say, well, I've forsaken it in my heart, I do drive a car, I do wear clothing, I have a house I live in, and so forth, but in forsaking these things, there are some who say, oh, that's a cop-out. Anyone can say they've forsaken it in their heart. And I guess that's true, anyone could say that. But that doesn't mean that simply because some people could say that insincerely, that it can't be said sincerely. The fact of the matter is, Abraham forsook Isaac. It's very clear. But he still had Isaac in his home for the rest of his life. And he still got to have he got to enjoy Isaac's presence as though he'd never forsaken him. But in his heart, he really had. Forever after this time, he could never think that he had any claim on Isaac. He had offered Isaac to the Lord, and whatever touches the altar is holy and separated to the Lord. And he knew that God just had restored Isaac to him by grace, and that he had no claim on that man, on that son, anymore. That had been determined. That was what was to be tested here. Whether Abram felt like he had a claim on that boy, or whether he had really resigned him to the Lord, and really had given him to the Lord, and he saw him as the Lord's son. And it's very clear that by giving these instructions and seeing Abram's obedience, that Abram did, in his heart, really forsake his son to the Lord, even though he lived with him in his house. And we need to die to all things. Jesus indicated that if a person comes to him and doesn't hate father and mother and wife and children and lands and his own life also, he cannot be a disciple. But this does not always mean that you literally break off all communication with your parents for the rest of your life to become a Christian, or that you leave your wife and children at home while you go off and do spiritual things, and neglect their support, or that you necessarily have to liquidate all your assets or even kill yourself since you have to hate your life also. None of those things are necessarily implied. What is implied is that just like Abraham, who offered Isaac on the altar, he actually forsook Isaac to the Lord. And that's how we are to forsake all things. We put them literally on the altar. And when they are on the altar, it means we really do give them to the Lord. Now, it might be the angel of the Lord will come and say, don't slay it. Don't get rid of it. I'm not finished with it. I've got use for it. Use that for me or whatever. But the fact that you still wear those shoes doesn't mean that you consider them yours now. You've forsaken them in your heart. They are the Lord's. And you would give them away if the Lord told you to do it, I trust. Or if you had any reason to suspect that the Lord wanted you to, you would. But the fact that you're wearing them doesn't mean you have not forsaken them. You don't have to wear a sheet and go around barefoot and so forth like some people do. There's, of course, the so-called Christ family cult. And their motto is no sex, no killing, and no materialism. And that translates into no marriage and no extramarital sex, no eating meat because that involves killing, and no wearing leather, so they don't wear shoes. And no materialism means they can't own anything except a sheet and an army blanket that they drape over themselves. I'm not sure why they cut themselves that much slack, why they're allowed to have 2 pieces of clothing. But at any rate, they think that this is what spirituality requires. And if they meet you and you claim to be a Christian and you're wearing clothes, except for a sheet, well, you're in compromise, and you might say, well, everything I have is the Lord's. They just see that as a cop-out. Now, I know some true Christians who are a little bit overbalanced in those areas too, who would treat it the same way. They feel like if you own anything, or if you appear to own anything, that you must not really have forsaken everything for the Lord. That's not fair, because Abram really did forsake his son to the Lord. But his neighbors couldn't tell that, because they didn't see what happened in Abram's heart, and they didn't see what happened up on Mount Moriah. All they saw was that Abram had his son still with him. But he knew there had been something that took place between him and God in his heart, and no one had any right to judge Abram in that matter, because clearly God saw that transaction and honored it. Now, this obedience evoked a new expression of blessing upon Abraham, and you can just imagine his elation when the angel of the Lord told him not to kill his son. I mean, this was the moment that he had dreaded, that he just thought, in any moment now I'm going to see my son's blood splattering all over the place. And but the angel says, don't do it. I mean, just imagine the burden that lifted when God said that to him. And now God tops that off with a pronouncement of blessing. And it says, the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord. This is the first time that an oath is attached to the promises, and God swears by himself. The writer of Hebrews says the reason God swore by himself is because it's customary always to swear by something greater than yourself. A man would swear by God or swear by Jerusalem or by the temple or something, because it was understood that when you're swearing an oath, you invoke the virtue of something higher than yourself. The reason you swear an oath in the first place is because people might question your own integrity, or else you wouldn't need an oath if they didn't question your integrity. But the fact that you're swearing an oath means that your own integrity maybe isn't isn't trusted by the person by itself, so you involve the merit and the integrity of something greater than yourself, like the temple or something. Basically, you endanger the integrity of God if you swear by God. Jesus taught us not to swear oaths. However, in the Old Testament, and even in Jesus' day, oaths were commonly sworn, and people would swear by something greater than themselves. But the writer of Hebrews says since God couldn't swear by anything greater than himself, because there isn't anything greater, he swore by himself. And so we have God saying, by myself I have sworn. That is, I swear by my own self, instead of I swear by heaven or earth or whatever. For because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy Son, thine only Son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And this goes on. And in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, the wording is interesting in verse 17. In blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thee. This probably means that as God is in the process of blessing people, he will not overlook Abram. He will bless him too. Or as he's in the process of multiplying nations, he will not overlook Abram's family. He'll multiply them too. Or it might mean that as Abraham is in the process of blessing, he himself will be blessed by God. As you are blessing, I will bless thee. It could be taken either way, and I've heard it referred to both ways by different preachers. I can't say that I know which way it should necessarily be taken. But something is added to the blessing, although there is a reference again to his seed being like the sand of the seashore and stars in the heaven. Those things have been said essentially in similar terms before. But at the end of verse 17, there's this added, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. Possessing the gate, of course, is basically to capture the city. When, in those days, of course, most cities, if they were considerable, had walls around them. And those walls were principally for defense against invasion. And there would be access to the cities only through gates, which usually had, these gates usually were very strong, either out of brass or maybe heavy wood gates, or there's something that they could close up the entry in the case of war, under a siege. Generally speaking, the citizenry of the city would live outside the walls of the city, and they'd have farmlands and everything out there. And then when the city was under siege, they'd run into the city, and the gates would be shut. And frequently, this besieging army would starve them out because their fields and their crops were outside the walls, and they couldn't get out to them to eat. So it was very frequent that famines would rage in a city while it was under siege. But the whole point of a siege was to get into the city, to invade the city and take it. And to do that, you either had to climb over the wall, which was frequently impossible due to the height of the walls, or maybe just because it was easy to defend the walls, or preferably to just break down the gate. And once you get the control of the gate, then you've got the city. The city's defenses are gone. And so he says concerning his seed, your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. In other words, the gate will be taken by his seed. His seed will actually be able to invade the enemy's territory and break the gates down. And the enemy will be defenseless against him. Now, however Abraham understood this, I don't know, but the Holy Spirit was speaking to him. This was God speaking to him. And we can now see the fulfillment of this in what Jesus said to Peter at Caesarea Philippi in Matthew chapter 16. Because he said to Peter, your name is Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And he said, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now what that means is, of course, the church, as it makes its aggression against the kingdom of darkness, will find the kingdom of darkness trying to put up a defense and a resistance against us. This has not anything to do with the church surviving the attacks of the enemy. It has to do with the church conquering the enemy. The enemy is on the defensive. The enemy shuts the gates, but their gates will not prevail. Their gates won't stand against the battering that we give them. The whole picture is, of course, that the church is the aggressive party. The church is moving forward, taking ground from the enemy. And the enemy will do all he can to stop us, but all he can is not enough to stop us. His gates, the best he can do to defend himself, will not withstand our attack. Samson, who was, of course, strengthened by the Spirit of the Lord, was shut into a Philistine city once. They tried to capture him, and he tore the gate off the hinges, this huge brass gate. He carried the gate up to a mountain and left it there for them to figure out how to get it back. But he just illustrated how the Spirit of the Lord just could tear down the gates of the enemy. And essentially when Jesus said, I'll build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, he was essentially saying that he, through his church, would possess the gates of the enemy. And that's what this prophecy is, that the seed of Abraham would possess the gate. What's exciting is that, of course, Christ is the seed, but Jesus is the one who said we are the ones who are going to be doing the battles for the kingdom of God. It is his church against which the gates of hell will not be able to stand up. So that we are given the honor and the dignity of winning those victories that were prophesied for Christ. For instance, when God said to Jesus, ask of me and I'll give you the heathen for your inheritance and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession, that's a promise made to Jesus, but we, the church, are the ones who are bringing that to pass by preaching the gospel to the heathen and taking it to the uttermost parts of the earth so they become his possession. We have the dignity and the honor bestowed upon us of carrying out and experiencing and fulfilling those promises that were made to Jesus and concerning Jesus. We are his arms and his legs, his hands, members of his body, and he is the one who is riding victoriously through the earth, conquering by his word. There's a picture of Christ in Revelation 19 as riding on a white horse with a sword going out of his mouth, with which he smites and conquers the nations. Is generally understood to be a picture of the second coming of Christ, and it may be. I'm quite willing to understand it as such. However, it can also be seen differently. It does not, for instance, describe him riding this white horse from heaven to earth, as in his second coming. It simply says he saw Jesus riding on a white horse, going about conquering with this sword that came out of his mouth. Well, in Zechariah chapter 10, I want to show you something real quick here. I don't know if I can justify the use of the time. I'm going to anyway. Zechariah chapter 10, I think it is. In verse 3, it says, Mine anger was kindled against the shepherds, and I punished the goats, for the Lord of hosts hath visited his flock, the house of Judah, and hath made them his goodly horse in the battle. In other words, God's people are his horse in the battle, the vehicle upon which he rides. In Revelation 19, we see Jesus riding a white horse and doing battle, conquering the nations with his word, the sharp sword that proceeds out of his mouth. This could be easily seen as a present picture of what is happening through the church going forth as Christ's vehicle. The white horse upon which he rides is his church, and the sword that goes out of his mouth is the word, the gospel that's being preached, with which he conquers the nations. This vision in Revelation has been interpreted that way by some, and whether they're correct or not, as far as its principal meaning, we can see that it would be applicable, because it is the church. The church is the agent of Christ's victory, of Christ's taking the gates of hell, and the gates of hell will not prevail against that church. And the prophecy was made here, your seed, which is Christ, and those who are in him, shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. That is, of course, through the preaching of the gospel to all nations, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abram returned unto his young men, who apparently never knew what went on, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abram dwelt at Beersheba. And it came to pass after these things that it was told to Abram, saying, Behold, Milcah, she has borne children unto thy brother Nahor. Remember, Milcah was Lot's sister. Lot and Milcah were both orphaned, nephew and niece of Abram and of his brother Nahor. And Nahor married Milcah, and she bore children for him. And the firstborn was Huz, and the second was Buz. Huz and Buz. And then Kemuel, the father of Aram, who the Arameans or the Syrians came from. Then Chesed and Hazo and Fildash and Jidlaph and Bethuel. Now, most of those names are not of importance to us, but Bethuel is, because Bethuel became the father of Rebekah, who became the wife of Isaac. So that is why it's mentioned here. Milcah, Abram's niece, married Abram's brother, and the grandson of that union, or the granddaughter of that union, Rebekah, married Abram's son Isaac. And Bethuel begat Rebekah, it says, verse 23, and these 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor, Abram's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she bare also Teba and Gaham and Thahash and Maacah. So this fellow Nahor had quite a few children by his wife Milcah and also by a concubine. And that news was brought to Abram after he offered Isaac upon the altar. Of course, that sets the stage for the next great event and that is the finding of a wife for Isaac.